I wake up every morning to the same silence, the kind that presses on the walls and makes every sound. Creaking floorboards, the ticking of the old clock, the faint rustle of leaves outside the window seem louder than it should be, and though 5 years have passed since my wife left this world, I still instinctively reach for her side of the bed, expecting the warmth that is no longer there, my hand brushing against the cold sheet, a reminder that I now live alone with my memories. The house is small by most standards, a modest 2-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town. Yet it feels cavernous to me now, each room echoing with the absence of her voice, her laughter, her steadying presence. And as I shuffle into the kitchen in my worn slippers, I still prepare the coffee exactly the way she used to make it. 3 spoonfuls of grounds, a pinch of salt, just enough water to keep it strong, though no matter how carefully I follow the ritual, it never tastes the same, because what made it perfect was not the recipe, but her hand. I retired years ago, after spending more than 4 decades balancing numbers for other people, guiding families through their financial choices, reminding young men and women of the importance of saving and planning for the future. And when I look back now, I find it almost ironic that I could advise so many others while my own family slipped quietly out of reach, as though the closer I tried to hold them, the more determined they became to push me aside. My daughter, Caroline, was once the center of my world, a bright-eyed child with curly hair and dimples that made strangers smile, and I still remember how she used to run to me when I came home from work, thrusting her school drawings into my hands, eager for praise, her voice full of trust and warmth, a little girl who looked at me as if I could do no wrong. I remember the night she asked me to read her the same storybook 3 times in a row, each time with new questions about the characters, and how my wife and I laughed afterward, whispering in the kitchen about how curious she was, how lucky we were. To have a daughter like her, those memories are both a comfort and a curse now, because the woman she has become bears so little resemblance to the child who once thought I was her hero. Since my wife passed away, grief has sat on me like a heavy coat, one I cannot shrug off no matter how many times people tell me that life goes on. I do not know how to move on when every corner of this house whispers her name, when every evening I set one plate on the table and remember the years when there were 3, then 4, when Caroline would chatter about school, later about her friends, her ambitions, the boys she fancied while her mother and I exchanged quiet smiles. Now the only sounds are the hum of the refrigerator and the clatter of my own fork against the plate. Sometimes I leave the television on for hours just to fill the silence, though I rarely pay attention to what is being said. It is the sound of voices I crave, even the hollow chatter of strangers on a screen. Caroline lives only a short drive away, but she might as well be on another continent for how seldom she comes by. She has her own life now, a husband who carries himself with the smugness of a man who believes he has married above his worth, and 2 children who used to run to me for hugs, but now barely manage a strained greeting at holidays when they bother to appear at all. I cannot remember the last time they stayed for more than an hour. The last time laughter filled this house. I tried in the beginning to stay connected, to offer help with the children, to bring over meals, to invite them for Sunday dinners, but each time the invitation was politely refused, always with the same excuses. Too busy, too tired, already, committed to something else. I accepted those excuses because I wanted to believe they were temporary. But over the years, the refusals hardened into silence, and now the only contact I receive is when Caroline needs something from me, usually financial help dressed up as a favor. For the sake of the family. It is difficult to describe the loneliness of old age to someone who has not lived it. People imagine it as simply being alone in a house, but in truth it is the sharp realization that the very people you once devoted yourself to no longer see you as necessary, that you have become a relic, a responsibility to be managed rather than a father to be cherished. When my wife was alive, we could face it together, the slow drift of our daughter into another orbit, the gradual erosion of family closeness, But after her death, there was no buffer, no one to soften the blows, no one to turn to in the long evenings when the phone did not ring. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit in her chair in the living room, the one where she used to knit or read, and I would talk aloud as if she were still there, asking her what I should do, whether I should confront Caroline about her distance, whether I should demand more respect, more love. But of course the chair remained silent, and I would end up whispering apologies to her memory for failing to hold our family together. The neighbors know me as the quiet old man who keeps his lawn tidy and waves politely but rarely engages in long conversations. They see Caroline's car in the driveway once in a while and assume she is attentive, that I am cared for, but they do not see how rushed her visits are, how quickly she shifts the subject away from memories of her mother, how she dismisses my grief, as if it were an embarrassing habit I should have grown out of by now. I remember one afternoon when I tried to tell her how much I missed her mother, how I still heard her voice in the kitchen, and Caroline cut me off with a sharp laugh and said, "Dad, you have to stop living in the past. She's gone. Crying won't bring her back." The words hit me harder than any physical blow because they stripped away the little dignity I had left in my mourning. So I began to cry less, at least in front of her, but the tears came at night in the privacy of my room, when the memories grew too heavy to carry. Sometimes I would wake with my pillow damp, ashamed of my weakness, though I knew grief was not weakness. It was love that had nowhere left to go. Yet Caroline saw it as something pathetic, something to be erased or controlled, and her impatience grew each time she saw me falter. She wanted me to be practical, to sell the house, to move into a smaller place or even a care facility, to stop holding on to the past. But what she could not understand was that this house was not just walls and floors. It was the vessel of my life. With her mother, the stage upon which our entire marriage unfolded, and letting go of it felt like betraying everything we had built together. I have lived 78 years, and in all that time I have never felt so diminished as I do now, standing on the threshold of each day with nothing to look forward to except the slow rituals of survival, making coffee, reading the paper, watering the plants, and hoping for a call that never comes. I know I am not without fault. I was not always the most demonstrative father, perhaps too strict, perhaps too absorbed in my work, but I loved my family with a steady devotion, and it is that devotion which now feels like a burden I carry alone. Sometimes I wonder if my wife would be disappointed in how things turned out, if she would blame me for the distance that has grown between Caroline and me, but then I remember her gentle reassurances, the way she would touch my hand and say, "She'll come around, give her time." I waited, but time has only widened the gap. As I sit at the kitchen table, the morning sun spilling across the faded linoleum, I feel the weight of years pressing down on me. Not just the years I have lived, but the years ahead, the ones I must face without my wife, without the comfort of family, sustained only by the stubborn hope that perhaps, just perhaps, Caroline will look at me one day not as a burden or an inconvenience, but as her father again. Until then, I live in this limbo, surrounded by memories, waiting for a knock on the door that will bring something other than requests for money or reminders that I am growing old. It was a gray afternoon in late March when Caroline finally appeared at my door without having first called to ask for money, and for a moment I allowed myself to imagine that she had come simply to visit, to sit with me in the living room, where her mother's photograph still rests on the mantel, to share a cup of tea and remember the woman we both had lost. Yet the look on her face when I opened the door was not one of tenderness or even polite concern, but of barely disguised impatience, as if she were arriving to perform an unpleasant duty rather than see her father. She stepped inside briskly, heels clicking against the floorboards, her perfume sharp in the stale air of the house, and without even a glance at the framed portrait of her mother, she announced that she did not have much time because she and her husband were meeting with a realtor later that evening. I remember feeling a twinge of shame that I had been so hopeful, that I had smoothed my shirt and combed my hair in anticipation of her visit, only to find that she was here with a purpose that had nothing to do with love or remembrance. She sat at the table across from me, folding her arms in a way that reminded me of her mother when she was determined to win an argument, but where her mother's expression had always carried warmth even in disagreement, Caroline's features had hardened over the years, her smile now more of a businesslike curve than an expression of joy. She asked how I was, the words flat and perfunctory, and when I tried to tell her that I still found myself speaking to her mother in the evenings, that grief had not loosened its hold on me, she rolled her eyes and said in a clipped voice, "Dad, you have to stop crying over Mom. She's gone, and no amount of tears will change that." The words struck me like ice water, not just for their cruelty, but for the casual way she dismissed the deepest wound of my life, as if my grief were an inconvenience to her schedule, an embarrassing quirk I should have grown out of. I wanted to tell her that love like ours does not vanish with the last heartbeat, that every day without her mother feels like a betrayal of the vows we made, but Caroline had already moved on in her mind to the real reason she had come. She began speaking quickly about the new house she and her husband were planning to buy, a bigger place in a better neighborhood with more room for the children, who were nearly grown now and, according to her, needed their own space. She explained how competitive the market was, how the bank required strong co-signers to approve the mortgage, and how, given her husband's debts and her own financial history, the best way forward would be if I agreed to sign the loan papers with them. At first, I did not even understand what she was asking. Me, an old man on a fixed income, joining them in a financial obligation of hundreds of thousands of dollars, but she spoke so quickly, so confidently, that I began to feel cornered, as though resistance would be not only futile but shameful, a failure to support the family. She reminded me of all the times I had helped before, paying for tuition, repairing their car, covering medical bills, and she said this would be no different, just another example of me being the steady hand her children could rely on. I tried to explain that I was not sure, that I needed time to think, but she reached across the table and took my hand, the gesture startling me because it had been so long since she had touched me without coldness, and she said softly, "Dad, it would mean the world to me if you did this. You'll be part of our home. It won't just be our house, it'll be yours too, a place where you can come any time, where you'll never have to feel alone." The words pierced me because they were exactly what I longed to hear, an invitation back into her life, a promise that I would not always be shut out, and though something deep inside whispered that her tone was rehearsed, that the warmth in her eyes flickered only when she needed something, I let myself believe her. The day she took me to the lawyer's office to sign the papers is etched into my memory with painful clarity. The office smelled of stale coffee and carpet cleaner, the kind of place where lives are changed in silence, and the young lawyer spoke in terms that might as well have been another language, explaining interest rates, liability clauses, and ownership structures, while Caroline nodded confidently as if she understood every word. I sat there with the pen in my hand, the documents spread before me, pages filled with fine print that blurred in my eyes, and when I hesitated, Caroline leaned closer and whispered, "It's just a formality, Dad. The bank wants reassurance. You won't actually have to pay anything, but it makes all the difference if your name is there." Her husband watched me with that wary, impatient expression he always wears when he thinks I might ruin his plans, and I felt the weight of both their expectations pressing down on me. I signed. My hand trembled as I scrawled my name across line after line, and I remember the sudden rush of shame as I realized that the pen left small blotches of ink, like tears staining the page, and though the lawyer congratulated us and Caroline beamed as though she had achieved some great victory, I felt no triumph, only the sting of betrayal. Betrayal not by them, but by myself. because in that moment I had chosen to surrender the last piece of independence I had in order to buy a promise of belonging that I already suspected was hollow. We left the office, and Caroline hugged me briefly, the kind of hug that is more an act of performance than affection, and she said, "Thank you, Dad. You'll see. This is the start of something new for all of us." I wanted desperately to believe her, wanted to imagine holidays in their new home with laughter around the table, grandchildren asking me to tell old stories, the sound of life filling, the emptiness that had consumed me since my wife's death. But as I watched them drive away, talking animatedly to each other without including me, I felt the first shadow of dread, as if I had just stepped onto a path that would lead not to reunion, but to further distance. That night, alone in my house, I sat staring at the empty chair where my wife once read her books, and I whispered, "Forgive me." I felt as though I had betrayed her memory, signing away not only money but the dignity she would have wanted me to preserve. I told myself I had done it for family, that Caroline's words about including me were sincere, but deep inside I already knew that I had given away more than I could afford, not in dollars but in trust, and that the consequences of my weakness would come sooner than I dared to imagine. The weeks that followed my signing of those papers should have been filled with anticipation, perhaps even joy, because Caroline had promised that this house would also be mine, a place where I would always be welcome. Yet the reality unfolded in a way that made the silence of my own small home seem almost merciful. At first there were calls, hurried but enthusiastic, as she told me about paint colors and furniture deliveries, how the children had chosen their rooms, how the kitchen had marble countertops that gleamed in the afternoon sun. She spoke of it as though she were describing a dream come true, and I listened with the eagerness of a man who hoped that at any moment she might say, "Come see for yourself, Dad. We need your advice. We want your presence." But that invitation never came. Each time I hinted, suggesting I could stop by with some wine or a cake from the bakery, her voice would tighten, and she would say that things were too hectic, that the house was still a mess, that soon, very soon, there would be a proper moment for me to come. I tried to silence the growing suspicion inside me, telling myself that moving into a new home was stressful, that she would keep her promise once they settled. But as days stretched into weeks, and weeks into months, my phone calls began to go unanswered. When she did pick up, her tone was brisk, her sentences clipped, as if she were speaking to a stranger whose time she could not spare. I asked once if the children liked the new place, and she replied, "Of course they do, Dad. Why wouldn't they?" Before rushing to say she had another call, I began to realize that I had not seen my grandchildren in nearly a year, not even on holidays, and when Christmas came, there was no invitation, only a package delivered by mail, containing a sweater too large and a card signed with their names in handwriting that did not look like theirs. The first real humiliation came when I decided, against her vague protests, to drive out to the neighborhood myself. It was a bright Saturday morning, and I told myself that any father had the right to visit the house where he was a co-owner, the home his own savings had helped secure. I remember turning onto the street lined with manicured lawns and identical mailboxes, feeling both nervous and hopeful, rehearsing in my mind the smile I would wear when she opened the door. But when I rang the bell, it was not Caroline who answered, but her husband, his face stiff with annoyance as though I had interrupted something important. "Oh, it's you," he said flatly, not even attempting to mask his displeasure. I asked if Caroline was home, and he replied that she was busy, that they were on their way out, and that I should have called first. I reminded him gently that this was my house too, that I had signed the mortgage with them, but he gave me a thin smile and said, "You signed what we needed. That doesn't mean you can just show up." Before I could answer, Caroline appeared behind him, her expression caught between irritation and embarrassment, and she said, "Dad, this really isn't a good time." We'll call you later." Then she closed the door with a finality that left me standing on the porch as though I were a solicitor who had overstayed his welcome. I drove home with a heaviness in my chest that no doctor could have diagnosed. It was not illness, it was rejection, a gnawing sense that the promises she had made in that lawyer's office had been nothing more than bait, words spoken to lure me into signing away my security. That night, as I sat with a plate of cold food, I thought about my wife and how she would have reacted, whether she would have scolded me for being so gullible, or whether she would have told me, as she always did, that love requires patience and forgiveness. I wanted to believe the latter, but the memory of the door closing in my face was too vivid. The humiliations multiplied in small, cutting ways. Caroline stopped answering my calls altogether for weeks at a time, and when she finally picked up, her voice was so flat that I wondered if she even recognized my number anymore. Once, when I did manage to reach her, she sighed heavily when I asked about the children, saying, "They're teenagers, Dad. They have their own lives. They don't have time to sit around with you." Another time, when I mentioned that the loneliness was hard to bear, she snapped, "Maybe you should think about a retirement home. At least then you'd have company." The words stung not only because of their cruelty, but because they reduced my existence to a problem she wanted off her hands, as if I were a burden too heavy to carry, a piece of furniture she no longer had room for. And then came the requests, always framed as necessities, never luxuries. One day she called after months of silence, her tone suddenly sweet, to ask if I could help with a large tuition payment. Another time it was repairs on the house, the very house I had supposedly been made a part of. Each time, though my pride screamed against it, I gave her what she asked, dipping into savings that had taken me decades to accumulate. I told myself it was for the grandchildren, for their future, but I could not ignore the truth that each check I wrote only seemed to widen the distance between us. She no longer said thank you, no longer pretended that my contributions were anything but expected. I became, in her eyes, a wallet with a fading face. There was one evening that still burns in my memory, when I decided to call unexpectedly, determined to hear her voice and remind her that I existed beyond my bank account. The phone rang and rang before she answered, her voice distracted, and when I asked if I could come over for dinner, she paused and then said, "Dad, it's not a good idea. Thornton thinks you're too emotional, and the kids get uncomfortable when you cry about Mom." I tried to explain that grief is not something one simply turns off, that I miss their mother every day, but she cut me off sharply, saying, "Please, just don't make things harder. We'll see you when things calm down." Then she hung up, leaving me with the hollow echo of rejection. It was the first time I allowed myself to consider that perhaps she truly did not want me in her life anymore, except when she needed something. I sat in the dim light of my kitchen that night, staring at the telephone as if it might ring again, and I realized that the bond I had once believed unbreakable had frayed beyond repair. Signing those mortgage papers had not brought me closer to her. It had given her permission to push me further away because now she had what she wanted, the security of my name, the reassurance of my money, without the burden of my presence. It was not just neglect I felt. It was erasure, as if she were rewriting the story of our family with me omitted, except for footnotes in the form of checks. And yet, in spite of all this, I could not bring myself to cut her off completely. Each time she asked for help, I complied, hoping foolishly that generosity might reignite affection, that she might remember I was more than a source of funds. But each gesture only deepened the humiliation. Each silence that followed each transfer of money made it clearer that I had become expendable. I thought often of my wife during those days, how she had once warned me that Caroline was practical to the point of coldness, and I dismissed it then as maternal worry. Now I saw that she had been right. Caroline was practical, yes, but in the way a merchant is practical, measuring the worth of everything in terms of profit and loss, even her father. The first escalation of our conflict was not a single explosive event, but a series of small, steady degradations. each one carving away at the dignity I had left, until I no longer felt like a father, but like an obligation to be managed, a nuisance, to be kept at arm's length. I understood then, with a clarity that frightened me, that what lay ahead would not be reconciliation but confrontation, that her hunger for security would not stop with my signature on a mortgage, and that my grief, which she dismissed as weakness, would soon be used against me in ways I had not yet imagined. The breaking point came not with a violent quarrel or some public scene, but with a quiet evening when the weight of all the small humiliations finally crystallized into something undeniable, and for the first time I understood that my daughter and her husband were not merely careless with me, but actively planning to cut me out of their lives except where my money could serve their ambitions. It was late autumn, the days shortening, the air already sharp with the promise of winter, and I received a call from Caroline after nearly 2 months of silence. At first my heart leapt at the sound of her voice, but within moments I realized she had not called out of longing or concern, for she spoke quickly, as though rehearsed, telling me that there were documents at the bank that needed my signature. Routine updates related to the mortgage, nothing to worry about. She said they would pick me up and drive me there the following morning, and though I felt a tremor of suspicion, I agreed, telling myself that at least I would see her, that perhaps there might even be time to sit together afterward. The next day, her husband drove while she sat in the passenger seat scrolling through her phone, barely acknowledging my presence in the back. At the bank, I was ushered into a small office where a manager greeted Caroline and Thornton with the familiarity of people who had met several times before, and only belatedly turned to me with a polite but distant smile. A stack of forms was placed before me, and though I tried to follow the explanations, the language was dense, filled with phrases about liability, co-ownership, future clauses, and something about medical certification. When I asked for clarification, Caroline squeezed my hand under the table and whispered, "It's just standard, Dad. Don't make this difficult. We're almost done." Her husband looked at me with the same guarded hostility I had come to recognize, as if daring me to resist. I did not sign that day. My hesitation angered them both. I could see it in the tightness of Caroline's jaw and the way Thornton slammed the car door when we left. But something in me had stirred, a faint but insistent instinct that if I put my name on those papers without understanding them, I would be giving away more than just money, perhaps even the right to determine my own life. That night I could not sleep, pacing the rooms of my house, running my hands over the photographs of my wife, asking her aloud what I should do. The shadows offered no answers, but the silence was different. It no longer felt like grief alone. It felt like a warning. The following week, the truth began to slip through in fragments. A neighbor who happened to work at the courthouse mentioned seeing Caroline there, inquiring about procedures for guardianship of elderly parents. Another acquaintance at the pharmacy told me that Caroline had asked questions about medications for memory loss, though I had never been prescribed anything of the sort. Slowly, like pieces of a puzzle forming a dreadful image, I realized that my daughter was not simply impatient with my grief. She was preparing to use it against me, to portray me as incapable, unstable, perhaps even senile, so that she could gain full control of the house and my savings. The mortgage I had signed had been the first step, a foothold in my life, and now she wanted the rest. I remember the moment of revelation with painful clarity. I had called Caroline, desperate to confront her, and after several ignored calls she finally answered, her voice sharp with irritation. I asked her directly whether she had spoken to anyone about guardianship, whether she was trying to have me declared incompetent. There was a pause, long enough for me to hear her breath quicken, and then she said in a tone that cut deeper than any denial, "Dad, you forget things all the time. You get confused. We're just trying to protect you from yourself." The words were delivered with such calm certainty that for a fleeting second I almost believed her, almost wondered if perhaps I had lost more of myself than I realized. But then I remembered the cruel smile on her husband's face, the way they whispered when they thought I could not hear, and I knew with chilling certainty that this was no act of protection, but of dispossession. That night I wept, not for myself, but for the final death of the bond between us, for the realization that the little girl who once clung to my hand and begged for another bedtime story was now preparing to strip me of my autonomy, to turn me into a helpless figure she could manage and exploit. My wife had always told me that grief would pass, that love would remain, but now even love had been twisted into a weapon against me. I sat at the table staring at the bank papers I had refused to sign, the clock ticking loudly in the stillness, and I swore silently that I would not be erased so easily, that if Caroline meant to cast me aside like a broken chair, I would not go, quietly. The turning point was not in what she said, but in what it forced me to see. That the battle ahead would not be about reconciliation or even respect, but about survival of the dignity I had left. They did not come at me with shouting or slammed doors or some melodramatic ultimatum that could have awakened a stubborn pride and sent me marching the other way. Instead, they came with clipboards and smiles and a tone of professional reasonableness that felt like a cool hand on the brow of a feverish patient. And in that gentleness was a violence I had not known possible, because it asked me to agree that I was slipping, that the man I knew myself to be had eroded into someone who required guardians, signatures, and systems to keep him from drowning in the shallow end of his own life. It began on a Sunday when Caroline called to say she and her husband were coming by with someone who can help, and before I could ask what kind of help, the line went dead, and I found myself hustling plates into the sink and straightening magazines, as if tidiness would prove I did not need saving. They arrived with a woman who called herself a geriatric care manager, brisk and fragrant and unthreatening, who moved through my kitchen with a practiced air, opening the refrigerator to check for expired milk, peering into the pill organizer on the counter, and asking questions in a sing-song voice about whether I ever forgot to eat, whether I had fallen in the last 6 months, whether I sometimes got lost driving to familiar places, and, while I tried to answer with dignity, Caroline hovered like a translator, completing my sentences in a lower voice, replacing my "No, I'm fine" with "Well, sometimes he gets confused," and my "I make my coffee every morning" with "He burns things." And when I protested that nothing had ever caught fire, her husband lifted his eyebrows and said that the smoke detector's batteries did not remove the smoke itself. When the woman laid a stapled packet on the table, "Consent forms," she said, "nothing binding, just permission for this and that, for the release of medical information, for the coordination of services, for the arrangement of automatic bill payments, so I would not worry." I felt my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with age, because what lay beneath the soft language of assistance was a scaffold on which they could hang a claim to my life. And I pushed the papers back across the table, and told them, in a voice I barely recognized as mine, that I would read them later and consult my doctor before signing anything. The care manager kept smiling, trained smile that did not falter when rebuffed, but Caroline's smile broke, and in its place came the expression I had known since she was a teenager, a quick, hard set of the mouth that meant she would not forget this. Slight, not because she feared for me, but because I had complicated her plan. After they left, I inspected the house as if it could tell me what I had missed, opening drawers and checking the small wooden box where I kept the items that remained of my wife. A brooch she wore to church, a lock of hair, the gold ring that I still rubbed between my fingers when the nights grew too long, and at first I thought I had misplaced it, because the ring was not where it should be, and I told myself to calm down, that age breeds forgetfulness, but I did not forget that ring. I searched. Again, then a third time, and the empty velvet cradle stared back at me, and with it came a realization so cold I had to sit down. Either I had finally become the man they said I was, losing the thread of simple things, or someone had taken the only piece of her I could hold. I slept badly, and woke determined to ask. And when I reached Caroline, she sounded offended that I could even form the question, said she would never touch Mom's keepsakes, then added that perhaps the ring had slipped behind a drawer or into a pocket, and before I could say that I had checked every pocket in the house, she hung up with a chirpy promise to look for it when she next visited. 2 days later, I saw her at the grocery store, an accident of aisles and timing, and there on her right hand glittered a thin gold band I knew as well as my own name. It had been resized, or perhaps she wore it on a different finger to dull my recognition. But when our eyes met, she tucked her hand under the strap of her purse and told me I was imagining things, that grief makes the mind attach itself to symbols. And anyway, rings look alike, don't they, Dad? I said nothing in the produce aisle because humiliation is louder in public, yet inside me something solid cracked. Not merely trust, but the thought that love could restrain opportunism. The next blow came with the quiet efficiency of a systems update. A letter from the insurance company thanking me for initiating a beneficiary change, which was baffling because I had made no such request. And when I called the number and waited. Through the on-hold music to speak to a representative, she explained in a kind voice that my daughter had phoned to help me, that a form was being mailed for my signature, and wasn't it nice to have family involved? I told her no changes were authorized, that any forms should be voided, and she said, "Of course, sir," and then asked, just as a matter of record, whether I had also requested a durable power of attorney document they had on file, which I had not, which made my hands tremble the way they had at the lawyer's table months earlier when my pen blotched the mortgage pages like tears. I hung up and stared at the wall while the refrigerator hummed and the clock kept its indifferent beat, and wondered how much of my life could be rearranged from a speakerphone on a kitchen island 3 neighborhoods away, how thin the membrane had become between me and the legal fiction of incapacity. They did not rely on paper alone. They understood the theater of evidence, and they set about staging it with the care of amateurs who fancy themselves directors. One Wednesday evening, a police officer knocked on my door for a welfare check, apologetic as he read from his tablet that a family member had reported concerns about self-neglect, spoiled food, wandering, a word that made me feel like a child in a storybook lost in the woods. He stepped into the kitchen and sniffed theatrically, and I could smell it too, a sharp, acrid ghost of burned milk that I had not made. A knob on the stove, still warm though I had eaten cold soup and crackers because I did not feel like cooking, and as I opened my mouth to protest, the officer asked me what day it was, and who the president was, and whether I knew my address, and I answered each question in a steady voice while fury climbed my throat, not at the officer who was doing his job, but at the small sick genius of whoever had entered my house with the spare key and turned the burner to create a scene that would corroborate a narrative. After he left, promising to note that I was oriented and coherent, I replaced the lock myself with a kit from the hardware store, hands clumsy with age and anger, and sat in the living room afterward with my wife's photograph in my lap, whispering that I was sorry to have brought our child to this point, though even as I spoke I knew that guilt was not the right word for a landscape shaped by someone else's choices. A week later, tea-colored envelopes began to arrive with windows that showed my name above words like important, and inside were polite threats from banks and utility companies linked to the property I had co-signed, not yet overdue, but emphasizing the seriousness of delinquency if unpaid, reminders that felt less like notices to a partner and more like warnings to a guarantor of last resort. When I called Caroline to ask whether everything was all right, she was breathless and brittle, said the lender had made errors, that they were in the middle of a refinance to secure a better rate, that my signature would be needed for a brief update, nothing binding, nothing new, just a housekeeping thing, and would I be so kind as to meet them at a notary on Friday. I said I would consider it. Then I did what I had failed to do before. I took the stack of letters and my trembling questions to the bank branch where a manager I had known for years met me in her glass-walled office and, after a few clicks and a frown, told me that the refinance had been denied twice due to new debt and late payments, that a home equity line application listing me as a co-applicant had been flagged for verification because my income did not match the supplied figures, and that a request for automated withdrawals from my account had been initiated and then blocked when the system detected a name mismatch. She said she could put additional safeguards around my accounts, that she could require in-person identification for any changes, and I agreed while the room tilted, because in that polite jargon was a picture of desperate people trying to pull levers fast enough to keep the machine from stalling. If the letters were paper blows, the next was flesh. Caroline invited me to their new house, at last, in a voice sticky with reconciliation, insisting that the children wanted to see me, that it had been too long, that they would grill in the backyard, and talk about the future like a family should, and because a starving man will accept even the suggestion of bread, I went. The lawn was perfect, the patio furniture new, the laughter brittle, and when the meat was cleared and the children vanished to their rooms with the speed of the disinterested, Caroline placed a leather folder on the table beside the citronella candle and said, "Let's go through a few things while you're here." And I knew then that I had been lured not for reunion, but for signatures. The first document was labeled HIPAA and permitted her to speak to my doctors. The second was a medical directive, not unreasonable in itself, and I said we could discuss it with my physician present. The third was a durable power of attorney. The words thick on the page, and the fourth was a quitclaim deed that would, with the grace of a single signature, simplify title, as Caroline put it, which in plain language meant remove my interest in the house I had been promised as part of the family. I looked up and saw her husband watching me the way a man watches a hawk, ready to clap at the precise moment it stoops, and I felt such an exhaustion then that I understood how people yield simply because the fight requires more strength than humiliation does. I stood, and the chair scraped loudly, and I told them that any further discussion would happen in a lawyer's office with someone whose duty was to me, and Caroline's face pinched, and she said I was being dramatic, and her husband leaned back with a thin, contemptuous smile and said almost lazily that paperwork had a way of catching up with old men whether they liked it or not. On my way out, I paused in the hallway where family photographs climbed the wall, glossy panels arranged in a chronology that might have included me if I counted as family anymore, and there in a silver frame was Caroline in a summer dress, laughing at something beyond the edge of the picture, and on her hand the ring I had cradled on sleepless nights. A flush of heat ran through me, and then a chill, not because of the theft, though that would have been enough, but because she had reframed a relic of her mother's love into an accessory for her own narrative, and as I closed the door behind me, I understood that she would use anything, my name, my money, my memories, to construct the life she believed she deserved. That belief, I learned soon after, had a price. An old colleague telephoned to ask after me, and, in the gentle way of men of our generation who skirt the edges of gossip, mentioned having seen Caroline's husband's name in a filing related to a bridge. Project gone wrong. Nothing catastrophic, thank God. No deaths, but cost overruns and defects and the kind of lawsuit that eats months and money. Suddenly the refinance, the frantic applications, the need to convert me from person to instrument made a terrible sense. I thanked my friend and sat alone until the daylight thinned, the house stretching into evening, and I admitted, at last, fully, that there would be no return to what I had hoped for, that my daughter's tenderness could not be purchased with checks or pen strokes, that I had not been a father in her calculus for a long time, only leverage. They made one more attempt that week, a call from the doctor's office urging me to come in for a cognitive screen your daughter requested, presented as routine the way a dentist might remind a patient to schedule a cleaning, and I went because I wanted a measure I could hold against the fog of accusation. The test was tedious and oddly childish. words to remember, shapes to copy, a clock to draw, and when it was over, the physician, a man who had known me through cholesterol checks and winter colds, looked me in the eye and said that whatever my daughter feared, I was not the thing she feared I was, and he printed a letter stating as much. I slid that paper into the same folder where I kept my wife's birth certificate and the deed to my little house, and in doing so, I felt a quiet pivot inside. Not yet a plan, not yet a strike, but the first hard outline of self-preservation. On the following Monday, Adult Protective Services called to follow up on a referral, their tone more bureaucratic than menacing, and I answered their questions with patience born of long years of accounting, precise and steady, while behind my calm was the knowledge that this was a prelude to something larger, that paper, policy, and performance were forming a net they meant to tighten. Night after night I sat at the small table where my wife and I had once eaten late suppers and discussed her garden, and I sorted documents into piles, and I wrote dates in a notebook, and I practiced saying no out loud so that the word would not stumble in my throat when I needed it most, and in those long rehearsals of refusal I realized that love is not always surrender, that sometimes the last mercy you can offer a child who has forgotten herself is to stop letting her forget you. The day of reckoning came not in a courtroom, not through letters in stiff envelopes, but in the trembling flesh of confrontation, when all the accumulated lies, humiliations, and betrayals collided with the stubbornness of an old man who finally refused to bow. I had thought, after the court's decision to force the sale of the house, that I might never see Caroline again, that she and Thornton would retreat into silence, licking their wounds in the shadows of whatever rental roof they found. But anger has a way of hunting down the man who denies it fuel, and soon enough they found me. It was a bright afternoon, the sun glinting on the lake outside my new apartment, when their black SUV screeched to a stop on the street below, the same vehicle that had once ferried me to Maine under the pretense of family reconciliation, and now served as a hearse for the last illusions I carried. Caroline burst from the car first, her hair disheveled, her eyes swollen as if from sleepless nights of rage and panic, her hands shaking not from weakness but from fury barely contained. Thornton followed, slower, his gaze cold and sharp, the way a butcher's knife reflects light without warmth. They cornered me outside a small cafe where I had been nursing a cup of tea, and their voices rose, drawing glances from passers-by. Caroline accused me of betrayal, of ruining their lives, of tearing apart the home that should have belonged to her children one day, and I listened, calm as stone, because I had rehearsed this moment in sleepless nights, because I had learned that their venom only burned when I let it under my skin. We moved inside to a corner table, the waitress eyeing us warily as she placed down menus none of us would touch. Caroline's voice cracked as she told me I had destroyed everything, that she had only ever acted out of care, that her lies about my health, her theft of my credit card, her abandonment of me in Maine, had all been for my own good. I let her finish, and then I spoke in a voice so steady it startled even me. I reminded her of the years of silence, of the phone calls ignored, of the grandchildren I had not seen in years, of the way she had treated me not as a father but as a wallet to be opened on demand. Thornton tried to cut in, sneering that I had always been difficult, that I had always wanted control, and I turned to him and said very quietly that control was the only thing I had left after they had stripped me of family. Then came Caroline's final weapon, the lie so sharp it could have gutted me had I not recognized the desperation behind it. She said her mother had confided in her, had told her that she regretted marrying me, that I had never understood her, that she had been lonely in our marriage. For a moment my vision blurred, because to doubt Lavinia's love was to doubt the ground beneath my feet, but then I looked at Caroline and saw the gloating glimmer in her eyes, the satisfaction of having found what she believed was my weakness, and I knew it was not truth but poison. My wife had loved me. I had seen it in every gentle gesture, every compromise, every shared silence. Caroline was not repeating her mother's words. She was inventing them to wound me. And I told her so, firmly, with a clarity that cut through her accusation. The cafe grew quiet around us. Thornton leaned forward, asking what I wanted, if I expected an apology, if I intended to squeeze them for more money. I shook my head. I told them I wanted nothing. Not their apology, not their explanations, not even their presence in my life. All I wanted was distance, silence, the right to live the remainder of my days without their manipulations. Caroline's voice dropped to a near whisper then, pleading that I could not mean it, that I did not truly want to die alone. I smiled sadly, because the truth was I had been alone for years already, ever since her mother's death, ever since Caroline decided that a father was less useful than an ATM. Her desperation twisted into fury once more. She leapt up, calling me a monster, accusing me of cruelty, promising that I would regret cutting her off when I lay dying without family at my bedside. I looked at her and felt no fear, no shame, only a heavy sorrow that this was the daughter I had raised, the daughter who had once pressed drawings into my hands and believed I was her hero. Thornton muttered that I would see sense eventually, that old men always did when loneliness closed in, but I knew better. I stood, leaving money for my tea on the table, and said that the only thing I regretted was clinging too long to the illusion of family where there was none. Then I walked out, past their glares, past the weight of their hatred, into the open air where the late sun glowed on the lake like a benediction. For the first time in many years, I felt light. They had thrown their last stones, and I had not fallen. I returned to my apartment, sat by the window, and let the silence settle, not as loneliness, but as peace. They could no longer touch me. Not with lies, not with papers, not with pleas. The house was gone, the car was gone, the money they had counted on was gone. What remained was mine, my dignity, my memories, and the quiet certainty that I had chosen truth over illusion. In the weeks after that final confrontation, I discovered that peace does not come in a sudden rush like water bursting through a dam, but rather seeps in slowly, filling the cracks left behind by grief and betrayal, until one morning you realize the house no longer feels like a tomb, but simply a place where you live, and the silence is no longer an accusation, but a companion. My new apartment, with its plain walls and modest view of the lake, carries none of the memories of the old house, and at first that absence wounded me, because I thought forgetting would be the cruelest fate of all. Yet, as the days lengthened into summer, I found that the emptiness allowed me to choose which memories to carry, and I carried the good ones. The warmth of my wife's hand on mine as we walked home from church, the sound of Caroline's laughter as a little girl when she discovered a frog in the garden pond, the simple joy of evenings filled with nothing more than conversation and the rustle of pages turning. The darker images, the slammed doors, the ignored phone calls, the poisoned words about guardianship and senility, those I let drift away like smoke, not because they were untrue, but because they had no power over me unless I held on to them. I did not hear from Caroline again after that day in the cafe, and though part of me still strained at every phone ring expecting her name, I learned to live without it. I imagine she tells people a version of the story in which she is the victim of a cruel, stubborn father, and I have no doubt that some believe her. It does not matter. I no longer need to be defended in the eyes of strangers. The truth sits quietly within me, and truth is enough. My grandchildren are nearly grown now, and whether they one day find their way back to me is something I cannot predict, nor do I try. If they come, I will welcome them with kindness, but I will not bend myself again into the shape of someone else's convenience. Sometimes, as I walk by the water in the early evenings, I think about how close I came to surrendering everything, how easily the documents and the lies and the staged performances could have stripped me of my last independence. It frightens me how thin the line can be between dignity and erasure for someone my age, how easily love can disguise hunger for control, how quickly a father can become a liability in the eyes of his own child. Yet, alongside that fear, there is also a strange gratitude, for in the fire of betrayal I discovered the steel of my own will, and in the wreckage of illusion I found a freedom I had not tasted in years. I am no longer waiting by the phone, no longer measuring my worth by Caroline's attention, no longer tethered to a house that had become a prison of memory. I live simply, and I live as myself. On Sundays I still attend church, and though the pew beside me is empty, I feel my wife's presence in the hymns and in the light that falls through the stained glass. I sometimes imagine her voice, steady and practical, saying, "You've done enough, now rest," and I believe she would approve of the path I have taken, even if it came through heartbreak. I keep her photograph on the mantel of this small apartment, and each evening I light a candle beside it, not out of superstition but as an act of continuity, a way of telling her that though the family fractured, the love she gave me endures. I am not naive. I know the years ahead are fewer than those behind. There will be no sudden restoration of family dinners, no miraculous return to the warmth of the past. But there will be mornings of quiet coffee by the lake, afternoons spent reading without interruption, evenings where grief is softened by acceptance rather than sharpened by rejection. I have my freedom, my dignity, and the unbroken memory of a marriage that outshines the bitterness of what followed. That is enough for me. In the end, what Caroline lost was not a house or a sum of money, but her father, and what I lost was the illusion that she had ever wanted me beyond what I could give. Yet in that loss I found clarity, and in clarity I found a strange kind of peace. I walk forward now, not as the man who was discarded, but as the man who survived it. And survival, in its quiet way, feels like victory.